Are there any ties between Mr. Trump, you or your campaign, and Putin and his regime?
No, there are not. It's absurd. There's no basis to it.
Maybe I'll say something good. Okay.
It's now clear that so-called fake news can have real-world consequences.
Here's what I think happened to the United States in the past 8 years.
No, I'm not going to give you a question. I'm not going to give you a question.
Can you state categorically?
You are fake news.
He ended up polarizing the country in a way that brings us close to fascism.
BuzzFeed then published a 35-page cache of memos from the alleged dossier, including a claim of sexual activity caught on a Moscow hotel room surveillance camera.
And in accompanying that, trains Republicans to just hate rule of law.
So let's walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I want to thank you all. God bless you, and God bless America. Thank you all for being in.
You have to spin up the ball of thread before you can tell the story.
Yeah, we don't know all of the details about this. What we do know, though, is Manafort went to Spain in January of 2017 and was actually there the day that the dossier was released.
The bombshell burst Tuesday evening when CNN reported the president-elect and President Obama were briefed on the matter last week. The report included unsubstantiated claims that Russian intelligence compiled a dossier on Mr. Trump during visits to Moscow. The website BuzzFeed then published a 35-page cache of memos from the alleged dossier. The New York Times and other major news organizations said they had been aware of the information for months, but could not verify the claims.
Manafort was meeting with a top deputy of Oleg Deripaska.
Oleg Deripaska, not just any Russian, the Russian.
Yeah. This is a meeting that is one of the ones that Amy Berman Jackson ruled he lied about to Robert Mueller, the purposes of.
According to the judge and her ruling today, that she said that there was enough evidence to show that he lied in at least 3 of those occasions. 2 of them had to do with Konstantin Kilimnik, is the name we've heard a lot.
Manafort said that it was about negotiating an end to the financial complaint that he and Oleg Deripaska were having over this Pericles fund that goes back years.
Paul Manafort is not just a political player in the Ukraine, in the region. He's also a financial force and does financial deals with some of the most powerful oligarchs in the region, including Oleg Deripaska.
Oleg Deripaska, an aluminum magnate, is thought to have close ties with Vladimir Putin.
The prosecutors found a message from Konstantin Kilimnik to Manafort saying, no, this is going to be about reestablishing the old relationship. So Manafort goes to Spain to talk to a Deripaska associate about, quote unquote, reestablishing the old relationship he had with Deripaska.
The only purpose for me or my people to have any interest in his, dealing future was to get money back, which was borrowed from my companies or improperly, taken, from investment which was done. And it's a big sum, up to 50 million.
The dossier comes out on January 10, 2017.
It comprised 3 basic things. One was there was a whole-scale campaign to interfere in the US election, that it was supported and funded by the Russian leadership, including Putin. Thirdly, that it was designed primarily to assist Donald Trump and to damage Hillary Clinton, rather than just to sow chaos in the American electorate. And fourthly, that there were elements of collusion between the members of the Trump campaign and the Russians and their agents.
Manafort comes back from that trip. And according to a May 2017 article from Ken Vogel, whose role as the scribe for this crowd deserves some notice, Ken Vogel writes up that Manafort came back from that trip and told Reince Priebus, I think that the allegations in the dossier about me don't make any sense. And I think that we can discredit the investigation, not just the dossier, but the entire investigation, by pointing to who funded the dossier, by pointing to Christopher Steele's role in it, and as well pointing to the inaccuracies in the dossier. And that is what we saw happen almost immediately in 2017.
Our top story tonight, the investigation into the discredited Trump dossier.
Because that's what the House Intelligence Committee focused on as they were pursuing their investigation.
Tomorrow is the deadline for the FBI and Department of Justice to turn over documents related to the anti-Trump dossier to the House Intel Committee. This coming after months of delays. Chairman Devin Nunes, frustrated over the delay, sent a letter to Deputy AG Rod Rosenstein, writing, quote, "It seems the DOJ and FBI need to be investigating themselves."
But even up until 2020, 2021, remember, one of the last things Donald Trump did was try and declassify this binder about the Russian investigation. A significant part of that is about Christopher Steele. Trump got dinged in London this year for trying to sue Christopher Steele.
The former president has also experienced a string of legal setbacks in courtrooms, now from Manhattan to South Florida, and now here in London.
He's still going after this Christopher Steele angle.
Did Steele have a reasonably good reputation with the FBI?
He was described to us as someone who had a very sound record of reporting on other cases, criminal cases, organized crime cases in the past.
Did you see this material yourself?
Not initially, but some weeks later, I ultimately was given a copy of those reports.
And what did you think?
You know, they're incredible. And I say that not, incredibly great or incredibly terrible, just incredible. You read them, and there were certainly details in there that were consistent with other collection that we had. And then there were details and claims in those reports that were just like things you would never imagine seeing in an intelligence report.
So Christopher Steele, former MI6 guy, he was known for being Litvinenko's handler.
Alexander Litvinenko had been working as a spy for MI6 when he was poisoned with the radioactive substance polonium-210. And Mr. Litvinenko had been a well-known critic of the Russian regime. The coroner was told that the British government had evidence that the Russians had Mr. Litvinenko killed and that it amounted to state-sponsored terrorism on the streets of London.
And it's likely that the Russians were trying to take him out from very early on because he was tied to Litvinenko, and Litvinenko was trying to expose the corruption in the Putin system. But Steele had then gone into private consulting. Apparently, a bunch of people do this.
It was actually a series of single-source intelligence reports over a period of time, if you like, almost a running commentary on the election campaign and Russia's perspective on it. And it comes from the Russian end of the telescope, if you like. The sources were Russian. They were reporting on how Russia saw it. And of course, that may in some cases be rather different than how it was viewed in America and at the other end of the telescope.
And he had taken to using a guy named Igor Danchenko. Igor Danchenko is Russian. He had done some kind of think tank work in D.C. Steele helped him get a think tank kind of job, which ended up serving as his cover effectively, but also gave him a way to stay in D.C. He was networking.
So Igor Danchenko is the one on trial charged with 5 counts of making false statements to the FBI, was paid more than $200,000 to attempt to serve as a confidential human source.
Danchenko was with people like Fiona Hill, who of course is brilliant and has herself said Steele probably got smoked. And so for the dossier, Danchenko is the primary subsource. Danchenko is also, again, he's a networker. So he also had met Chuck Dolan.
Then you have Charles Dolan in the middle, whose name is less well known, but he's a longtime Democrat operative. Friday, FBI agents testified Dolan had connections to Putin's press secretary.
Chuck Dolan was putting together a conference for people who want to do business in Russia. Dolan was in Russia in June 2016. Dolan asks Danchenko for help, so that gives Danchenko a couple excuses to go to Russia and just meet the people he knows. Again, he's a networker. He described the FBI in his original interview. He was just talking to friends. The people to whom he sourced the P tape were people he got drunk with, and it was just gossip. And it's gossip with foundation.
Do you remember Pizzagate? The one about Hillary Clinton running a child sex ring from the basement of a pizza parlor?
So the Podesta emails were the information that powered the Pizzagate conspiracy.
And you can guess who was behind the hacking of those emails. Comet Pizza's a real place, and there were emails between Podesta and the restaurant's owner. But that whole story was a classic Soviet-style con.
They look for any sort of division.
And how can we actually emphasize those divisions and actually make people lose trust in one another?
Create a big, bold lie, something so outrageous no one could possibly believe it was made up.
Also so egregious that if they could get people to believe it, it would be totally damning.
Like, there are many instances where we have reason to believe that the Russians did take video when Trump was traveling into Moscow. No one ever really debunked the story that they gave him prostitutes when he was there in 2013 with Miss Universe, right?
In one case, they heard about a Marriott official who had overheard two other Marriott executives talking about what to do with a tape of Trump in an elevator with Russian women at a Ritz-Carlton hotel in Moscow.
Just gossip.
So for people who haven't been following as closely, this is a document that we started hearing about really in the fall of last year as the campaigns were in full swing.
That's right. I mean, there was some great reporting by Mother Jones where they interviewed who would later turn out to be Christopher Steele himself. It got lost in the mix at that point, but as we see here, it's just an ever growing importance behind this document. And the latest revelation was a big one, this connection with Free Beacon and potentially Paul Singer, the Republican billionaire mega donor.
There's this story that Paul Singer paid for what often is referred to as the dossier, and then the Democrats picked it up. That story is actually not accurate.
Well, first of all, what the DNC chairman there just said is not true. The whole idea that Republicans started this dossier, we have absolutely no evidence of that.
What Paul Singer paid for was Fusion GPS open source research. The open source research, by and large, turned out to be accurate. They had experts on Russia looking up actual legal documents. That's the stuff that, with a couple of exceptions, was never discredited. So, yes, he started it. Fusion then goes to the Democrats and say, pick up this project. And what's incredibly important about this is that Oleg Deripaska was there at the beginning of the dossier. Oleg Deripaska had a separate relationship with Christopher Steele.
And I want to show a clip that starts with two KGB defectors who said disinformation had one goal:
to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country.
Starting in March of 2016, when Paul Manafort is publicly named a member of Trump's campaign, Oleg Deripaska, through an attorney, pays Christopher Steele to collect on Paul Manafort, to start human collection on Paul Manafort.
In an exclusive interview with Hill TV's John Solomon, Deripaska talked about his relationship with Manafort and what role it played in the Russia investigation.
Here on Hill TV, there's so much to talk about in the U.S.-Russia relationship. I can't wait to jump right in. So at some point, one of your lawyers, I think, came to work in a capacity with Christopher Steele. I wonder if you could just describe yourself, what that relationship was like, whether you ever dealt with him directly or whether it was just a research project with one of your law firms.
It was a research project to support one of the cases against me in London. But my understanding that the lawyers trust him for some reason, and he was for quite time on retainer. And as you know, I know that you find the stories. They approached me and introduced me to some people in justice, and we have, one conversation.
Right.
And the circumstances of this are really vague. There's not one public document that says this is where the dossier project came for. And Christopher Steele, I put in my article on this, denies that Deripaska would have ever learned of the dossier project. The DOJ-IG investigation, the Carter Page investigation, there's a bunch of classified footnotes that in fact suggests Russian intelligence learned who was part of Christopher Steele's reporting network before the dossier project started, that describes Deripaska learning, or a Deripaska associate who might be the attorney, might be Kilimnik, learning of the project before the second report. So you get the P-tape report.
Mr. Trump was bringing his case over 2 memos in the dossier which claimed he had taken part in, and I'm warning now, this is graphic, had taken part in sex parties while in St. Petersburg and engaged in golden showers with prostitutes in Moscow.
Everything after that comes after Deripaska reportedly learned of the dossier project. And then you've got, in that same time period, 2 Russian spooks who learn of the dossier project in that same time period. Those reports may actually overlap. They may both be references to Deripaska because, of course, Kilimnik now, the American intelligence community at least, refers to him as a Russian spy, and a couple of other Deripaska associates.
Konstantin Kilimnik, a Russian political operative, is the 20th person indicted by Mueller's team. Kilimnik worked for former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort's political consulting firm, Davis Manafort Partners International, in Ukraine.
This is the story that never gets told, is that Deripaska pays Christopher Steele to collect on Paul Manafort starting in March of 2016. This is according to the Durham report and a number of other things. And as part of that, Steele asks Fusion for help. So before the Democrats come in, Steele is paying Fusion for help on collecting on Paul Manafort. And then after Trump sews up the nomination, Fusion starts paying Steele for this broader collection project, which includes Manafort, includes Michael Cohen, includes Carter Page, includes Sergei Millian.
And why did Mr. Trump want your help?
Because Trump team, they realized that we have a lot of connection with Russian investors. And they noticed that we bring a lot of investors from Russia.
And they wanted your connection with the Russian investors?
They needed my assistance, yes, to sell properties and sell some of the assets to Russian investors.
So you became the official broker for Donald Trump?
I became the official broker for Trump Hollywood.
And how many units did you sell?
That's because we cannot disclose the financials, and we have in fact signed that we cannot disclose that, but a nice percentage of all the units sold, out of 200 units, they were sold to Russians.
To Russians?
Yes.
So the Russian money was heavily invested in that?
Absolutely.
And have there been other projects too?
That some of my colleagues, they were involved in some other projects, but overall, Trump has done significant business with Russians, and the level of business amounts to hundreds of millions of dollars that he received as a result of interaction with Russian businessmen.
Hundreds of millions of dollars from Russian businessmen?
Correct.
So he likes Russia because there's money to be made there?
He likes Russia because he likes beautiful Russian ladies, and he likes talking to them, of course, and he likes to be able to make a lot of money with Russians. Yes, correct.
Are you involved in any way with Russian intelligence agencies?
Absolutely no.
You've heard that, right?
Of course.
What do you say?
So I'm not involved.
Not involved? Do you ever report back to them?
Absolutely no.
Do they ever ask you questions, or?
No.
But you have friends inside the government, don't you?
Of course.
So that's one thing people need to understand is Oleg Deripaska is there on the front end. And Oleg Deripaska, at least according to footnotes in the DOJ report, probably learned about this effort in real time.
Propaganda is most effective when there's a little bit of truth in it.
The most successful operations of that kind contain some truthful element so that the disinformation is eventually accepted as a whole.
Conceal your hand, making it seem like the story came from somewhere else.
Nobody was searching about the origin, how it started, who published the story first. This was, of course, a method then repeated again and again.
And that changes the hypothesis that the dossier was filled with disinformation along the way. Because it means that somebody who was involved in the Russian attack, somebody who was instrumental in getting Trump's campaign strategy on August 2nd, 2016. That's what Kilimnik was doing, right?
You report some amazing detail. Meetings between Manafort and the Trump operative Rick Gates, and also a Russian-Ukrainian political operative named Konstantin Kilimnik. You say that Gates gave Kilimnik internal polling in 2016 on battleground states. I mean, that an American Trump campaign official gave it to a Russian-Ukrainian official. What do you think that was all about?
So in addition to that, Christian, that was repeatedly given. And in the middle of the summer of that campaign, August 2nd of 2016, Konstantin Kilimnik flew from Moscow to meet with Paul Manafort. And one of the things that we were able to piece together in a recount is Kilimnik comes and asks Paul Manafort to get Trump's commitment when he becomes president to allow Russia to take over half of Ukraine. But we don't know the other side of that, which is what was it that Paul Manafort was going to demand in exchange?
And also, what was the internal polling data used for?
It's unimaginable to me that Paul Manafort, who's a very smart person, would not understand how those could be used. And that he can have plausible deniability to say, I gave it, I don't know what they did with it, but to close your eyes to how that could be used by the Russians seems to me a bit far-fetched for somebody who's experienced and smart.
And Kilimnik was doing it in the context of this apparent quid pro quo that Manafort said he didn't buy on. So you've got somebody who's got a key role in this investigation who learns about the dossier very early on. And as I say in my report, Republicans, like every Republican who investigated this at some point said, oh, yeah, Russian disinformation. This was riddled with Russian disinformation. But they don't do this next step, which is, OK, then let's look at the stories that get told.
No one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country.
And one of the stories that get told, and this actually may just be Steele trying to protect his relationship with Deripaska. He kept working for Deripaska into 2017. And this you can point to Bruce Orr's notes, conversations between him and Christopher Steele.
I think that Bruce Orr is a disgrace with his wife, Nellie. For him to be in the Justice Department and to be doing what he did, that is a disgrace.
So Steele, trying to keep a client, want to focus too much on Deripaska. And remember, Christopher Steele believed that he could flip Deripaska.
Right.
He had told Bruce Orr, who then was in charge of DOJ's transnational crime unit.
So who is Bruce Orr? Orr has worked for the DOJ since 1991 and reached the position of Associate Deputy Attorney General. But according to the Washington Post, he was transferred from that job in late 2017, and it's unclear what position he holds now. Trump's beef with Orr stems from the Steele dossier. His wife, Nellie, has worked with Fusion GPS.
Steele told Orr in the months leading up to the Russian attack that Deripaska really wasn't that close to Vladimir Putin, could be flipped.
They approached me and introduced me to some people in justice.
In 2015, Steele was trying to get Orr to flip all of these Russian oligarchs. That's the background. Steele believes Deripaska is a good guy, is a reasonable guy. And so he's working for Deripaska through an attorney. And Deripaska wants to collect information detrimental to Paul Manafort. And he tells Steele, and Steele tells DOJ, he says, I have it out for Paul Manafort. I want to take on Paul Manafort legally.
The former CIA station chief here, Steve Hall, who was in Moscow, I think talked about you and Manafort and the connection between you and Manafort, and said, if you want to understand this, this is like the connection between Putin and Trump. Now, why would he say something like that if there wasn't a perception that somehow you're connected? I mean, how do you respond to those kind of comments?
It's like, oral kind of story. They're absurd.
He suggests that he wants to help DOJ investigate Paul Manafort. So one of the things that's going on is Deripaska is playing this absolutely brutal double game. And Manafort is really the victim in this. I think if Republicans and Democrats started talking about the way in which Deripaska totally fucked over Paul Manafort, we might not be at each other's throats.
Right.
Deripaska is, on one hand, through Steele, making Manafort more insecure. And remember, Manafort's dead broke. He's trying to get in good with Deripaska again. He's trying to dig himself out of this huge financial hole he's in. So Deripaska making Manafort less secure on one end, and then using Manafort's insecurity on the other end to get assistance with this campaign operation, to learn Trump's strategy, to get Manafort kind of buying into whatever Kilimnik is pushing. That's the background. And one of the stories that gets told, and this report was one of the most contentious ones because it was part of the Igor Danchenko trial.
Special counsel John Durham's investigation into the FBI's targeting of Donald Trump in 2016 suffered a blow Tuesday when Igor Danchenko, a think tank analyst accused of lying to the FBI about his role in the creation of a dossier about former President Trump, was found not guilty.
What he was charged for was that he lied about an anonymous phone call that he received, which put a tie, a alleged strong tie, between Trump officials and Russian agents. So they said he lied about that, or at least Durham did, but the agents said they believed him.
Danchenko and Steele very quickly diverged about this project, about what Danchenko told Steele. There's no record of what Danchenko told Steele. And so, in other words, Danchenko said, I got this call from somebody I think might be Sergei Milyan, and he said that there were ties between Russia and Trump, but that was no big deal.
He likes Russia because he likes beautiful Russian ladies, and he likes talking to them, of course, and he likes to be able to make a lot of money with Russians.
And in the report, it shows up as much more. In the report, it shows up as a conspiracy of coordination. That's where the notion of conspiracy of coordination comes from. That is used in the Carter Page FISA warrant, and therefore is the core of the claims of corruption about the dossier.
The FBI relied on the dossier and FISA applications, knowing there was likely material originating from a political campaign, a political opponent.
So somewhere it got blown up. Danchenko says he basically admitted he wasn't for sure that it was Milyan who called him. And honestly, what he claims Milyan told him is very consistent with what Milyan was bragging about to other people.
Trump has done significant business with Russians.
Milyan was bragging about his access to Trump. Milyan was pitching George Papadopoulos in those same weeks on getting Russian support for Trump. But it turns into this conspiracy of coordination.
Well, President Trump called for an end to special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation earlier today, calling it, quote, totally conflicted and discredited. That follows the release of heavily redacted documents this weekend related to federal surveillance of former Trump campaign advisor Carter Page because of his ties to Russia.
The president blamed the, quote, unverified and fake dirty dossier that was paid for by crooked Hillary Clinton and the DNC as the basis for the FBI tracking Page.
And in that report, it describes that Paul Manafort is the focus of this conspiracy of coordination, but it is done through Carter Page. Now, think through the implications of that, right? What it did is it got everyone looking at Carter Page and no one looking at Konstantin Kilimnik. So you've got Carter Page under a FISA order, and meanwhile, Konstantin Kilimnik waltzes into the cigar bar on August 2nd.
According to Mueller's team, Kilimnik met with Manafort multiple times in the U.S. after Manafort became Trump's campaign chairman. One of those meetings came just days after Manafort was asked about his connections to Russia.
Are there any ties between Mr. Trump, you or your campaign, and Putin and his regime?
No, there are not. It's absurd. There's no basis to it.
And no one's paying attention. And by the way, Republicans will also say, oh, Konstantin Kilimnik was an informant for State Department.
Democrats now have their own Russia spy scandal. Why? Well, if you believe the Senate Intelligence Committee report that came out last week, it claimed that a man named Konstantin Kilimnik, who was an associate of Paul Manafort, well, Kilimnik was a Russian intelligence officer, according to the Senate Intelligence Committee report. Well, if Kilimnik was a Russian intelligence officer, then the Obama-Biden State Department has a very serious problem. Robert Mueller's Russian investigation showed that Kilimnik had repeated chronic contact with senior officials in the State Department. The State Department considered him what they call a sensitive source, meaning someone who is providing political intelligence to the State Department. The State Department rewarded Kilimnik for his help by feeding him non-public, sensitive diplomatic information back to him, such as readouts of what went on in private meetings, the perception of what the State Department had about various Ukrainians, even how Hillary Clinton might rule on the issues of Ukraine if she became president in 2016.
And I don't dispute that, but they don't think through the implications of that. What do spies like to do?
So I think that trying to paint him as a Russian agent is basically a way for people who want a proxy war in Ukraine, who want to expand NATO to Russia's borders in Ukraine. I think this is an attempt by them to basically stigmatize any attempt to resolve the crisis and to make peace. This is what Kalimnik told me about that.
There was basically a very general discussion about how to approach the peace process. And Paul said, look, I mean, there is no role for Yanukovych. I don't see it. Maybe many years down the road, but I just don't see that happening. And, my advice to our friends in the opposition bloc in Kiev is to basically start communicating with the civic society, using their business ties, using their economic ties with the region, and show them they're not traitors. They have not abandoned the region, and the region still remains Ukraine.
Yeah.
None of that stuff happened. But, I think I had similar discussions with people at the State Department.
They like to infiltrate themselves into foreign intelligence. And Kalimnik, going back years, had close ties to people at state. The people who were working with him were like, I think this guy's a Russian spy. He's sharing stuff with the Russians. That's one story that gets told.
Right.
The story that gets told is that Carter Page is Paul Manafort's go-between. And the Sissy report, and I include this in that post, the Sissy report is sort of like, dudes, how is it that Christopher Steele doesn't mention Deripaska in any of these reports? And it's a question that Steele really should be asked by people who built up his reputation, because it's one that really would answer a lot of questions about the dossier. How is it that Steele, who is being told by Deripaska about his relationship with Paul Manafort, that never makes it into the dossier? And as a result, we're looking at Carter Page. We're not looking at Konstantin Kalimnik.
Disinformation, basically, it means deliberately distorted information that is secretly leaked into the communication process in order to deceive and manipulate.
Throughout the reports, and if you go back and you read this, it's actually pretty interesting. Every report says the Russians have compromat on Hillary Clinton, and they're thinking of releasing it, and that compromat is years old intercepts from when she was in Russia as Secretary of State or as First Lady.
I hope that you know how much the American people admire the efforts and sacrifice that all Russians are making, and that we will continue to support you. And what you are doing actually helps renew our own faith in democracy.
If they know that the Democrats are reading this and taking this seriously, what that's saying to the Democrats is, don't worry about the hack that you're struggling with to this day. If compromat is coming, it's old intercepts. It's not the emails we just stole from John Podesta. So in other words, their cybersecurity contractor told them, yeah, usually, these stolen emails aren't released. So they didn't think anything was going to be released. They didn't prepare for it until it happened, and then until it happened again.
Boy, that WikiLeaks has done a job on her, hasn't it?
But then, to my mind, the most important story that gets told, and this goes back to the way in which Russia pre-compromised a bunch of Trump's associates. The most important story that gets told, and the one that was the measure of the Russian investigation from the start, are the Cohen stories.
President Trump's personal lawyer is suing BuzzFeed for defamation after the site published the now infamous Trump dossier early last year. The dossier includes allegations that Cohen had secret meetings with Kremlin officials in Prague in August 2016, just weeks after President Trump accepted the Republican nomination.
3 reports in October of 2016, and then one again in December of 2016. The 4th one is incredibly incendiary.
The December memo alleged that 4 Trump representatives traveled to Prague in August or September in 2016 for secret discussions with Kremlin representatives and associated operators hackers about how to pay hackers secretly for penetrating Democratic Party computer systems and contingency plans for covering up operations.
Right? Imagine if that were true. Trump campaign paid the hackers who hacked Hillary Clinton. Not true, by the way. But the stories that get told in October of 2016, and these were the day after the dossier was released publicly, some intelligence community, probably Czech, contacted the FBI or contacted the CIA or whoever and said, we think this is deliberate misinformation. We think that these reports about Cohen in particular are deliberate misinformation. So from the start, the FBI had the expectation that the Cohen ones were disinformation.
Disinformation. It was such a big deal that every KGB agent was required to spend 25% of their time coming up with ideas for false stories. And in their year-end review, yes, KGB agents had year-end reviews too, every agent was evaluated on
how many proposals for disinformation operations he submitted.
But remember the core premise of the stories that get told in October of 2016, 3+1 reports. One is that Michael Cohen is Trump's fixer.
Cohen's lawyer released a secret recording from 2016 of Cohen and Trump discussing how they could buy the rights to Playboy model Karen McDougal's story of an alleged long-running affair with Mr. Trump, an affair the White House denies.
When it comes time for the financing, which will be... Listen, what financing? We'll have to pay you.
True. These reports all come out while he is setting up the Stormy Daniels payment. So it is true that Michael Cohen is the fixer and he's sloshing money around. The more I write on this, the more I think about the likelihood that Russia learned of the Stormy Daniels payment in real time and therefore was piggybacking on this. But it is describing in the weeks that Michael Cohen is busy serving as a fixer on the hush payments, it is premised on Michael Cohen serving as a fixer for the Russian stuff. But the other premise of this, and this is what I think is incredibly important, is that Michael Cohen was in direct contact with the Kremlin.
When Mr. Trump did run in 2016, Cohen was frequently by his side.
The words the media should be using to describe Mr. Trump are generous, compassionate.
But at the same time, we now know Cohen was quietly talking with Russians about a Trump Tower project in Moscow. In early 2017, Cohen fiercely defended then-President-elect Trump when asked about Russia.
Is there anybody that you know of, that anybody knows talk to anybody in Russia?
No,
Nobody.
There's no relationship.
Right? The premise is he goes to Czechlands and meets with some cover organizations. But the premise is that he's in direct contact with the Kremlin. He's in direct contact with the Kremlin about this whole investigation. As I described when I laid out how the Russian investigation worked, by July 27th, 2016, Dmitry Peskov, one of Putin's closest aides, remains one of his closest aides, Dmitry Peskov knew that Donald Trump and Michael Cohen were lying. And they were lying to cover up the fact that Michael Cohen really did have contact with the Kremlin.
And there were developers in Russia that wanted to put a lot of money into developments in Russia, and they wanted us to do it, but it never worked out. Frankly, I didn't want to do it for a couple of different reasons.
It wasn't major. It was just a phone call to the Kremlin in January of 2016 before he won the primary saying, yes, I would be willing to pursue loans from sanctioned banks. Yes, I would be willing to pursue a relationship with a retired GRU officer because I so badly want this Trump Tower in Moscow. So Dmitry Peskov knew that Trump and Cohen were lying about having contact with the Kremlin. He knew that in July. That was public in July.
Frankly, I didn't want to do it for a couple of different reasons.
Dmitry Peskov is Vladimir Putin's PR guy, effectively. Has been for well over a decade. And is a much more trusted associate than that. He was sanctioned in 2018 with a bunch of other people. And he was sanctioned because he was involved in this kind of disinformation effort and undermining democracy effort. But he's like the Dan Scavino of Vladimir Putin. In other words, he is somebody who has been, in Dan Scavino's case, Trump's mouthpiece for so long, he becomes an appendage to the guy.
My name is Dan Scavino. When I was 16 years old, I got a part-time job at a golf course just outside of New York City.
And so that's who Dmitry Peskov is. Like why Felix Sater told Michael Cohen to call Dmitry Peskov to arrange a Trump Tower deal, that's telling, right? Because that's not the mayor of Moscow. That's not the person who would actually make the decision. But he does call, and probably it felt like less of an ask for Cohen to call the press secretary than it would be to call the head of GRU. Maybe a better analogy even still is Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller writes all of Trump's speeches.
Jeff, as you know, one thing for sure, you don't want to be called out by your hometown rabbi. And that is what happened this week to senior presidential advisor Stephen Miller, an influential force in the Trump administration, especially on controversial immigration policies.
And in that role, it seems like a minor role, but Stephen Miller is really the architect of Trump's ties to neo-Nazis, Trump's ties to fascists. And he has a significant role in always pushing that side of Trump. And what makes this disinformation angle all the more interesting is that story, the Cohen stories, all four of them, came from a woman named Olga Galkina. She was Igor Danchenko's childhood friend.
Galkina was working in Cyprus at an affiliate of XBT holding SA, a web services company best known for its Webzilla internet hosting unit. XBT is owned by Russian internet entrepreneur Alexei Gubarev.
Igor Danchenko was Christopher Steele's primary source. He became an FBI informant. And so in the course of networking, Igor Danchenko became associates with a guy named Chuck Dolan, who had done PR for Russia for years and had worked with, guess who? Dmitry Peska.
We turn now to the view from inside the Kremlin and an interview with President Vladimir Putin's chief spokesman, Dmitry Peskov. He's also the deputy chief of staff to Putin.
Don't push us into the corner. No. Then we said, listen, guys, we are not happy with this coup in Ukraine. And you have guarantees by Poland, by France, and by Germany. We're deeply convinced that NATO machine is not a machine of cooperation and is not a machine of security. It's a machine of confrontation.
So Danchenko did become friends with Chuck Dolan. Dolan knew that his friend, Olga Galkina, was looking for PR help.
When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, pretty much everyone assumed that its disinformation apparatus died too.
Our government's view was problem solved. No more active measures, no more disinformation.
It also meant the end of Vladimir Putin's KGB career. But within a decade, he was back. First as head of the renamed KGB, the FSB, and not long after, as the president.
And when Igor Danchenko says, I've got these names, I'm looking for dirt on them, and those names include Carter Page and Paul Manafort and Sergei Millian and Michael Cohen.
When he talked to Galkina in the fall of 2016, he believes it was a phone call. He rattled off these names and out of them. Danchenko was surprised to hear that Galkina later Danchenko softened this to almost immediately recognize Cohen's name.
The only name she recognizes, and she recognizes it almost right away, is Michael Cohen. So Olga Galkina, who has ties to Dmitry Peskov, who is the guy who knows that Michael Cohen and Donald Trump are hiding an actual phone call with the Kremlin during the election.
The Russian government haven't been in any contacts, in any official contacts with members and with the members of the team of either of the candidates. Well, of course, on expert level, people are talking to each other in every camp, so it's quite natural, it's quite normal.
Olga Galkina is the one who immediately recognizes Michael Cohen's name and spins this story about him having direct contacts with the Kremlin. And that's the story that really is the core, the most damning core of the Steele dossier.
It just keeps coming in. McClatchy's reporting right now that Special Counsel Robert Mueller has evidence that Trump's personal lawyer and fixer, Michael Cohen, secretly made a late summer trip to Prague during the 2016 presidential campaign. According to two sources familiar with the matter, confirmation of the trip would affirm part of the Steele dossier that Cohen strategized in Prague with a powerful Kremlin figure about Russian meddling in the U.S. election. And it would be one of the most significant developments of the investigation thus far.
Danchenko keeps asking her to go back for more information. The December report, the one I mentioned that describes Cohen actually paying for the hackers, that one was free. The project was done. The DNC, at least, is no longer paying for it. I think Podesta may have been involved in later conversations, but he shouldn't have been collecting that. And nevertheless, he gets this freebie right as the CIA, right as everyone is beginning this assessment of what happened with the Russian investigation. And all of a sudden, into Christopher Steele's lap comes the smoking gun. Michael Cohen paid for the hackers, came via Olga Galkina again. that last report included some cybersecurity allegations about her employer, which were obviously bogus, but sort of a cover story for the actual Prigozhin trolling. So it attributed to her then employer all the stuff that we know was actually attributed to Yevgeny Prigozhin.
Russian news outlets are reporting that a social media troll factory owned by Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Russian mercenary leader, used to allegedly influence public opinion in the United States and other countries, has been disbanded following the stunning mutiny by Prigozhin and his Wagner Group fighters in Russia last month. The U.S. government and European Union have long accused Prigozhin of funding an organization known as the Internet Research Agency, which Washington says is a troll farm that tried to meddle in the 2016 presidential election. Prigozhin himself has previously admitted to interfering in U.S. elections and that he founded and financed the organization, although the Kremlin has always denied any interference.
So that's the premise of the Steele dossier. And so if you buy that Oleg Deripaska and others learned about the project early on, I mean, really early, after the first report, at least, and then found a way to inject it full of these stories which were near misses, stuff that you would chase, stuff that would be very scintillating, but stuff that, in fact, served to distract and served to make the Democrats complacent and served to heighten Michael Cohen's discomfort. Michael Cohen was hiding a secret.
There's no relationship.
Donald Trump was hiding a secret.
Frankly, I didn't want to do it for a couple of different reasons.
And when you eventually have an investigation, if you look at the way in which Michael Cohen prepared to lie to Congress to cover up the Trump Tower deal, and by the way, Trump's company was withholding the email that made it clear that he actually did contact Dmitry Peskov's office. If you recall, Cohen was telling the public and telling Congress, oh, I just sent an email to the public line for Dmitry Peskov. I got no response. That was a lie. He did get a response. It's unclear how much of that Mueller got, but we know that they did not turn over the email proving that Cohen actually did talk to Dmitry Peskov's office. And when he went to Congress, he was like, I'm just going to deny I was ever in Prague. I was not in Prague. I was not in Prague. I was not in Prague. And that served as a substitution for denial of the Trump Tower stuff.
But Putin isn't sowing all this chaos just for fun. All along, he's had a single goal. See, in terms of population and GDP, Russia is actually a pretty small country, especially when compared to a unified Western world. But Putin knows that if he can pit the West against itself and break up our alliances, Russia is suddenly much more powerful and can take on other countries one by one.
It's important to understand that Oleg Deripaska was on both ends of that story. The smoking gun story that blew up in the dossier, the Michael Cohen reports, were sourced to a woman known to have ties to the one guy in Russia who I can guarantee you knew that Michael Cohen and Donald Trump were lying about a call to the Kremlin because Cohen had made that call to Peskov's office himself. And this is what I think we'll be talking about in weeks ahead, that Paul Manafort never goes away. He's in prison and he is working with Rudy Giuliani effectively to follow up, to frame the Bidens. It never goes away.
The technical term for what we do is lobby. Purposes of today, I will admit that in a narrower sense, some people might term it influence peddling.
That's a story. Again, we don't know what Galkina's deal was. We don't know how many of Danchenko's sources knew that they were feeding him garbage. And some of it was Danchenko at least comes off as somebody who was operating in good faith.
The veteran Justice Department official connected to Christopher Steele and called out by the Inspector General for, quote, consequential errors in judgment, is just retired from the Justice Department.
Steele, I don't know what to make of Steele.
The reaction in certainly the US could be described as almost some kind of mass panic about Russian interference. Do you think that that was justified?
It was a panic maybe, but I think it was more of a sort of Marmite reaction. It was more of it was a divisive reaction, something that we would always have considered in our careers in government to be bread and butter, consensus, national security territory. The interference of a hostile authoritarian state in your elections. We never had any clue that it would become such a partisan, such a divisive, such a non-conformity issue over the years. I mean, it's been extraordinary how it's dragged on, and it's still actually dragging on now.
Again, Steele denies that Deripaska knew this. Steele has not, as far as I know, publicly dealt with the fact that he was in this relationship with Deripaska through all of this. It's not dissimilar, by the way, from the way in which Deripaska kind of cultivated Charles McGonigal, right?
Charles McGonigal used to supervise investigations into Russian oligarchs, then went to allegedly work for and get paid a lot of money by Oleg Deripaska.
Yeah, I mean, that's the crux of this charge right here, right? So this is the former top official running the New York FBI field office counterintelligence operation, preeminent position in the Bureau. Now, he is charged with violating money laundering and sanctions laws because of work he did once he left the Bureau. He started working for Oleg Deripaska. He is a sanctioned Russian oligarch because of his close ties to Russian President Vladimir Putin.
By May of 2017, U.S. spooks had concluded that Oleg Deripaska was a Russian spy, was working for Russian spies. So the head of counterintelligence in the New York FBI field office, he thinks he can flip Deripaska. Same motive that Christopher Steele was operating. I can flip Deripaska. And so he starts getting close to Deripaska and he ends up doing stupid things.
They say that he was hired to dig up dirt on a rival of Deripaska's and that he hid this relationship by using a shell company and forging signatures to try to keep the path away from him so no one could detect this.
You asked how the dossier came to substitute for the Russian investigation. The people who say that, all of them, ignore that the dossier was not released. It's not like Clinton Cash, where a book by Steve Bannon and Peter Schweitzer was published full of allegations and sent to the New York Times and used as the core for a whole series of reporting, which is overt.
The Clintons have sold out their own people for cold cash. Stephen K. Bannon and Peter Schweitzer, we dare you to sue us because we are dying to get into discovery with you and go through chapter and verse of your absolutely amoral corruption.
Clinton Cash was used to predicate 3 different investigations into Hillary Clinton at the FBI.
CNN has learned that federal authorities down in Arkansas are now actively investigating the Clinton Family Foundation for public corruption, alleged public corruption. A U.S. official tells me that the FBI and federal prosecutors down in Little Rock are specifically digging into whether foundation donors were improperly promised policy favors or special access to Clinton while she was Secretary of State. Now, CNN reported back in November 2016 that the FBI had opened preliminary inquiries into whether there had been any sort of impropriety with the foundation's dealings, and that caused some tensions within the Bureau and the Justice Department. And so the current inquiry, at least in part, is a continuation of that probe that originated before the presidential election. But what's unclear is precisely what new evidence, if any, ignited the current federal investigation after those initial inquiries were stalled. A spokesperson for the Clinton Foundation said the Clinton Foundation has been subjected to politically motivated allegations, and time after time, those allegations have been proven false. Nevertheless, this probe comes in the midst of a really sensitive time for the Justice Department under this administration, as the president continues to demand time after time that his political rival be investigated while the Justice Department stays silent.
So if you have a problem with partisan disinformation predicating investigations, your problem is with Steve Bannon. Your problem is with Peter Schweitzer. It's not with Hillary Clinton. And remember, Hillary Clinton never said, I'm going to publish the dossier. And the people who did release it thought that they just wanted it to be checked. They were alarmed by it. I think that it's just an unfortunate mess. And one of the things that is true is that this operation ended up discrediting virtually all of the Russian experts in the U.S. government.
Meanwhile, new allegations surrounding the man at the center of House Republicans' impeachment inquiry of President Biden. Former FBI informant Alexander Smirnov seen here leaving a courtroom in Las Vegas Tuesday. Last week, after he was arrested for lying and obstruction of justice, Smirnov allegedly told an FBI agent officials associated with Russian intelligence were involved in passing a story about businessperson one, who sources say is Hunter Biden.
Somebody's asked the FBI, really? This is your valued source? If he's now some spy? I mean, holy cow.
Disinformation is more effective if there is a a nub of truth to it, or if there's projection. What Russia is doing now against Joe Biden, they're claiming that the prosecution of Donald Trump is political dissidence.
Putin's spokesperson said, quote, "It is obvious that political rivals are being eliminated there," he's talking about here in the U.S., "through all legal and illegal means that's invisible to the whole world with the naked eye." Again, that's Putin's spokesperson. It is a bit ironic and rich that this is coming just months after Putin's own fiercest critic, Alexei Navalny, died in a Siberian prison.
They're claiming that the CIA is spreading disinformation about Ukraine. Disinformation does a number of things. It muddles the truth. It makes people question what they're told. In the larger question, how Trump trained Republicans to hate rule of law. It's all of this. He did this without Russia needing to tell him how to do it. He gets out there and he says he's the victim. It's the same thing Russia is going to say. There's no reason to believe they wouldn't coordinate at this point. We can point to people close to Trump reaching out to Russian spies. At this point, it would be unshocking if Trump were overtly coordinating with Russian spies, but they don't need to coordinate. They never needed to coordinate because their modus operandi has always been the same. Always lie. Always claim to be the victim, always project. And therefore, the stories that Russia was going to tell are the same stories that Donald Trump was always going to tell.
It was supposed to be a routine news conference with the president of Moldova. But President Putin used it to pour scorn on anyone associated with Washington's dirty dossier, those unverified allegations of compromising sexual behavior by Donald Trump. People who cook up hoaxes like that, he said, are worse than prostitutes. But then, in a sarcastic segue, he went on to remind everybody of the details. Trump organized beauty contests, he said, and socialized with the most beautiful woman in the world. I find it hard to believe that he rushed to a hotel to meet with Russian girls of loose morals. Although, he added, we do have the best ones in the world.
How did the dossier become the substitute for the Russian investigation? Partly through the efforts of HIPSI, which I'll talk about, I think, in the next installment or the one after. Partly through people like Glenn Greenwald and Aaron Mate, who presented themselves as skeptics and to this day say it was all about the dossier. People like Matt Taibbi, for example. Matt Taibbi keeps saying, oh, no one ever bothered to call Konstantin Kilimnik to ask him if he's a spy. I asked him if he's a spy, and he says no. Aaron Mate says the same thing, right? These are people who've been in contact with Konstantin Kilimnik and are repeating laughably false stories from Konstantin Kilimnik.
And he explained to me, as he said before, that the polling data was not sophisticated as was widely said in the media. And it was shared for a very simple reason, that basically Manafort wanted to drum up business in Ukraine. So he wanted to show that the guy he was working for, Donald Trump, was in the race and had a chance of winning.
I don't know where anyone's bad faith begins, if at all. Like, you can tell this entire story where everyone but the Russian spooks are engaged in good faith. We were all the victim of this. We were all the victim of the fact that allegedly Russian spies decided to tell false stories to the American people. And Hillary Clinton, the notion that Hillary Clinton is responsible for being victimized by Russian disinformation is nonsense. We were all the victim of this.
Thanks for listening to Ball of Thread. Expect a new episode about every 2 weeks until the election. To support this series and get answers to your questions with a bonus Q&A podcast, go to patreon.com/balloffthread. You can join us for as little as $1 a month. We appreciate your sharing this work with anyone who cares about the Constitution, and please consider giving us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts.